In the previous video, we saw how to create a database on HostGator and get it all set up so that we can connect to it using Node. The one thing I went ahead and added behind the scenes is I added a new column to our table, or to our table in our database, so that when we select from our database, we can see whether we're selecting the right thing by having another thing besides the ID, right? So instead of me selecting the ID and giving it the ID, I'm going to select the ID and get the name. And you'll see that when we do our first query. And this I did just for the sake of the demonstration, so that again you can see what happens when you are trying to get something based on an ID, since you'll be doing something very similar. So let's go ahead and start a new project. And we're going to start it using npm init. We can call it SQL demo. That's fine, fine, fine. This is all fine. Move on. We're going to create our new file. And then I'm going to go ahead and just open this whole folder. Okay, so we have our index.js, which is going to be empty. And I had the previous IP address that I had copied over. I'm just going to save this here. If you remember from the previous video, I said one of the things that we needed was going to be that IP address. So I've gone ahead and put that as a comment here. One of the things that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to install mySQL, which is something we're going to use to be able to access a SQL database using Node. So we'll do MySQL equals require MySQL. So for the sake of this demo, we're not going to be using Express or anything. We're not going to be working with any type of HTML. We're just going to be doing some console.log so that we can see whether our connection actually works. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to create a connection. Create connection is a function of this package that actually takes in a JSON as a parameter, and that JSON needs to have all of the information that we need to connect to our database. So this IP address here that we had from before, we actually need for this part. So we need a host. That's that number that I gave you. We need a user, and that's the user that we created earlier. We need a password, and that's the password, the really bad password that I made for the sake of the demo. And we need a host, or excuse me, we need a port, which specific to HostGator is 3306. The other thing that we need, and that I almost forgot, is we need a database. And so I named the database vcchoppers_sample. Super important that you don't forget these commas after each argument, otherwise you're going to get an error. So this creates the connection, but we haven't actually connected yet. So what we want to do is call the connect function and use a callback function to see if we got an error. forget our semicolon. So if there's an error, we're going to say console.log connection error. And we can print the error if we want. Otherwise, we are going to say connection successful. All right. There are multiple reasons why one could get an error upon connecting. So one could get an error if any of these is missing or is incorrect. One can get an error if you forgot to add the wildcard host access to your HostGator account, or to your database rather. One could get an error if one forgot to create a user, or if one forgot to add the user to the actual database itself. So let's make sure that we have this running correctly. I notice that we're not listening in on any ports, we're not getting any information, like we're just creating that connection and seeing if that works. And we got a connection successful. And really, we should be closing the connection once we're done inside this script. So once we're done, we can close our connection. We're doing connection.end. And then we can do a console.log. Connection closed. This should be parentheses. All right, so let's try that again. Okay. So the ordering of those printing out was a bit strange, but we got a successful connection. Remember that with a callback function, upon this being executed, this gets executed. And the if, executing this if in console.log took a little longer than executing this and then this. Okay, so let's say we want to do a query. So to do a query, we do connection.query. And this is going to take two arguments. Here is going to actually be the query as a string. And then you're going to get a callback function that potentially has an error, potentially has some rows, and potentially has some fields. So again, if there's an error, we probably want to say that there was an error with the query. And we just want to exit out. Otherwise, well, let's print what we got, right? Let's see what these rows and columns are. Or rows and fields, excuse me. Okay, so let's see. Oh, wait, we actually need a query first. So let's select from Let's select, what do we want? We want the name, right? So remember that I added that column, had the name. The from needs to be the table name. And I'm trying to remember what I named the table and I can't. Sample table. Where, let's see, let's do ID equals 33. So we should get the word 33. So let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so we got something. We seem to have received some sort of object. Let's index into this and see what we get. Still got the same thing. Let me put this guy as a callback function in here so it's not randomly printing. Function. Okay, there we go. So by putting it inside as a callback function, this console.log will only execute once this connection.end has executed. All right, so we see that we're not getting an error, which is good. So that means that our query is being executed correctly. But we are getting this object, and we're having trouble accessing it. So when this, and I know this because I've done this a couple times, but when the connection works, you should be able to actually see what gets outputted. And it looks very similar to a JSON, rather than just seeing this object. So something funky is happening here. For example, if I were getting the name correctly, I should be able to do, oh, there we go. Okay. So it's weird that it's not printing the whole JSON format, but usually what happens when you run a query like this and you try to print all of the rows, or you try to print the first set of rows and the first set of fields, usually what happens is you actually get something showing you what that JSON looks like. But we are having issues with that for some reason, which is weird because this hasn't happened before. But we are getting the correct response because if I get the very first row, so remember, this is a spreadsheet, right? Or it's a table. So when we get, we're selecting the name from the table where it equals 33, it's going to return essentially another, like a sub table with any results that match this. In this case, there's only one value in my table that has the value, the ID 33. So it's going to return this whole row, this whole row right here. And I want to access the name because that's the only thing that's there. So by telling it, give me the name of the first row, I can go ahead and do that. I wanted to show you what the fields look like. We're not actually going to be using the fields. It gives other information about the table, but for all the stuff that we're doing, we're really only working with the rows, right? Where you want to get usually you should only be getting one result, and you can actually check how many results you got. But usually you're only going to be getting one result, in which case you can just index directly into the JSON and get the name that you want, or rather the response object. So we're going to go ahead and get rid of this. And let's add, so let's say that I try to get an ID that's not there. I should say something, right? So let's say if rows.length equals 0. Ooh. I want to do a console.log say no results. And then I want to exit out so that I don't try to access this. If I forget this return, you'll try to access this and then you'll get an error. So I don't have, I believe, any number 30 in here in my database. So it should tell me no results. For the sake of demo, let's say that I forget to put in this return here and that other line of code gets executed. You'll see that you get this wild errors. It looks pretty scary, and then you read the actual first thing. It says, cannot read property name of undefined. And we see that we have no results, but then we tried to access the name of row 0. There's nothing at row 0, and that's why it's giving that error. So by returning early, we say, hey, do not execute any more code. All right, so that's a pretty simple demo of how to access and query your database, right? So we're just you run the query as you would on mySQL. Right, we're selecting the name from the table where the ID is something. Now, in this case, we're hard coding it, but you're going to want to use some sort of variable, right? So in your case, you know, it's not going to necessarily be it's going to be an ID, but it's going to be a different type of ID, right? It could be by the session, it could be by the username, to try and find your users based on, you know, when they try to log in, based on their username and their password. And once they're or when they're trying to log in based on their username and their password, and once they're already logged in, you want to look for that session to see if you have that session saved so that you can automatically load their profile, and their profile is there without them having to log in, right, if they haven't already logged out. So this is a really, really quick demo. Hopefully you found this helpful. If I have time, I'll try to do a part 2, a sequel to the sequel, haha, where we start getting a little more fancy and start trying to, for example, integrate some Express, send some responses over, use some variables, rather than just these hard-coded queries. I make no promises, but I will try my best to get to it.